Welcome, everyone. At the U.S. Strategic Technology Fund, we focus on technologies that shape America's security and competitiveness, from aerospace and energy to artificial intelligence. Now, AI is often talked about in terms of productivity tools or consumer apps, but it is quickly becoming part of national security decision making. That raises a big question. Can we trust these systems in high stakes moments, or might they push us towards more conflict? So to dig into that, I'm joined by Jonathan Panter, co-author of a new paper on how large language models behave in simulated geopolitical crises, also known as wargaming. Jonathan is a Stanton Nuclear Security Fellow at the Council on Foreign Relations, where he studies how unmanned systems and automation may shape maritime crisis management and escalation. He's also a former U.S. Navy surface warfare officer who's deployed twice in support of Operation Inherent Resolve, and he earned his PhD in political science from Columbia University, where his dissertation critiqued naval forward presence operations and examined the drivers of U.S. military readiness. Jonathan's latest research shows that with some surprisingly simple interventions, AI models can be steered away from risky escalatory behavior. Today we're going to unpack what that means, not just for defense, but for the broader question of how we use AI responsibly in sensitive domains. Now, before we jump into this conversation with Jonathan, I just want to remind everyone that this presentation and this discussion is for informational purposes only. It is not an offer to buy or sell securities. If you want to learn more about our disclosures, go to av-funds.com/disclosures. And thanks everyone for being here, and hope you enjoy my discussion with Dr. Panter. I'll let him talk a little bit more about his background and kind of why the study came to be. But really, at a high level, we're starting to see, officials across government, across DoD, bringing AI into wargaming scenarios, into, conflict resolution, even platforms that, many of us know, like ChatGPT. And so what Jonathan and the team did was really started to dig into what does that mean? How do these models, escalate or de-escalate conflict? What are things that we can do on kind of the prompting side or in the models that we use to kind of change these outcomes? I think where we can get more accurate, we can get outcomes maybe that we want. So I'll stop there and pass it over to Jonathan, maybe just a brief background on yourself, and then a little bit of kind of the origin and history behind this paper, and then we'll dive in.
Great, thanks, Drew, and thanks for inviting me on. Right now, I'm the Stanton Nuclear Security Fellow at the Council on Foreign Relations. It's a one-year fellowship where my focus is nuclear deterrence, but also conventional deterrence. My background prior to that, I was working on a PhD at Columbia University, which I received last year in political science and international relations, and my dissertation broadly was about the question of naval deterrence. And prior to that, I served as a surface warfare officer in the U.S. Navy. So while at the Council this year, I've been looking at a variety of emerging technologies and assessing the extent to which their integration affects the U.S. Military's ability not only to operate, but also to deter our adversaries. And of course, the hot question of the day is AI. And to date, most of the research on this, including some of my own and a paper, including a paper I wrote last year as well, has been on the integration of AI into battlefield uses for tactical and operational advantage. Be that edge computing on individual platforms or integrated battle management platforms across a particular theater. And while that's a terribly important area, what we're beginning to see is that as the end users, being the U.S. military and the U.S. government, become comfortable with the applications at the tactical and operational levels of war, the next step appears to be an interest in applications at the strategic level of war or even the political military level. And that's compounded by the fact that a lot of the companies producing leading edge large language models are certainly very interested in selling that capability to the U.S. government. You may have noticed a few days ago that ChatGPT or OpenAI rather announced that they were going to offer for free an enterprise version of ChatGPT to U.S. government users for 1 year, to basically familiarize and get those users comfortable with them, probably for follow-on sales.
Yeah, it's fantastic, and I was going to say I'm glad you brought up this kind of distinction between when people hear AI national security, they tend to think, like what we're seeing in drone swarms or maybe missile systems, kind of more at the edge. And I think this rise of what you're talking about of strategy it feels like a very natural progression, or even something that comes online faster than some of these other technologies that we hear about in the news.
Yeah, and even in the most basic sense, you have to imagine that a lot of the individuals who are working across different bureaus, let's say in the State Department or in the policy planning staff or in the National Security Council or in DoD, in their private lives are using LLMs for all sorts of applications. And it we can expect that individuals in time-constrained environments working under pressure may, want to query an LLM for a quick set of bullet points for briefing their principal or taking notes during a meeting. And so the question then becomes, do any of these large language models that government customers are using have predispositions to behaviors that would be suboptimal for national security?
And that's a concern that is across applications, even if it's for bullet points in a meeting. If that meeting is about something that is critical to the national security apparatus of the U.S., it may be a small impact, but some of these biases or things in the operations of these models can have an impact. But you, in this paper specifically, really looked at kind of what's called a war game, and I'll ask you to maybe describe that process. We know what this is. I'm sure people listening maybe know what this is, but just what this process looks like now, and then kind of maybe the importance or even the urgency of what that process is.
For sure. So, as I mentioned, this interest in the use of AI for political and strategic applications is an emerging field. We only have very few papers that are out about this subject, including two that used war games. And my co-author and I, when we read these papers, we had some questions essentially about the methodology and the replicability of the findings. So we decided to take one of these papers, which is quite well regarded. It's an excellent paper, and I do find its findings compelling, and to replicate it, to semi-replicating it, using a lot of their methodology with our own LLM and our own orchestrating program. And broadly speaking, the reason we use war games is to be able to test scenarios and see how we would respond, see how an adversary would respond without having to go through them in real life. And so war games are an essential part of the U.S. Military and U.S. defense apparatus's learning process, and really have been since the advent of operations research and the beginning of the nuclear era after 1945, because obviously since we don't have much empirical, or we don't have really any empirical data at all about nuclear wars. Nuclear weapons have only been used once in combat and only on a non-nuclear armed adversary. During the Cold War, when we wanted to play out how a nuclear war would happen between two partners, all we have is war games.
And maybe to the extent that you can share, I think as we learn more about, if this is totally foreign to them, of this wargaming process, I don't think it will be, but if it is, you might even say this is a great opportunity for AI, and this is why these officials and these members are using the tools that they're maybe using in their home lives, or they're using in a different function. How is that? What is the current process for wargaming, kind of in a pre-AI world? And how is that changing? Before we even dive into the potential issues or calibrations that might be required, what has kind of state of play been for the last few decades, last few centuries even?
You get a bunch of people in a room. You assign them parts to play. Some are the blue team, some are the red team, which is own team and the adversary. You provide them generally with a scenario of some kind, and usually there's also a third-party independent game operator who's updating each of the players on the respective actions in the game. So it often, just some of these games can be very simple. They can play out in an hour, and some of them can play out over the course of several weeks, which with real-world admirals and generals being invited to participate. And so in the papers that have been written so far examining AI models in this context, one of the benefits of using AI is that you can replicate your findings multiple times over. You can run thousands of simulations and be able to get trend data in the way that people act and in the way of what sort of general reactions follow particular actions and so on, in a way that you couldn't with individual human players who have other things going on in their lives, and so they can't run 1,000 simulations of a single war game.
Hey everyone, I hope you're enjoying my conversation with Jonathan Panter, the co-author of an excellent paper on the use of AI and LLMs in wargaming scenarios. Before we jump back into the second half of the interview, I just wanted to share a little bit more about our U.S. Strategic Technology Fund. This is a fund within Alumni Ventures, the largest venture firm in America for individual investors. We offer simple venture portfolios. For over 11,000 individual investors to date, we've raised over $1.4 billion in capital. Our U.S. Strategic Technology Fund is focused on those technologies that are critical to U.S. and allied dominance. We invest in things like aerospace, energy, cybersecurity, critical infrastructure, manufacturing, industrials, and all of the things that are keeping our nation more secure. If you're interested in learning more or you're interested in joining the fund, you can see the QR codes on the screen behind me. The QR code on the left side of the screen gives you a self-service portal and access to our data room. The QR code on the right side of our screen is to schedule a call with one of our senior partners if you're interested in learning more about the fund's dynamics. And if you're already an investor, we appreciate having you in the community. Feel free to reach out to me, Hillary, or Stephanie, or anyone else that you've been in contact with at Alumni Ventures, and we will get you pointed in the right direction. Thanks so much, and hope you enjoy the rest of my conversation. And you know, you're listening, you're probably, even not having read the paper and your co-author wrote, starting to see the potential risks or concerns if we're relying on AI for this. We see the benefits. To your point, we can run more of these simulations. You're not constrained by, you know, human time hours. But just talk through the potential concerns, things that you were seeing. You know, what is the potential like negative impact with some of these models that are being used, or you know what we're starting to see with the kind of increased presence of specifically these LLMs for these wargaming scenarios.
Well, people aren't terribly concerned with the use of the LLMs in the war game itself because it's just a game, and so, you know, no matter what happens and what the LLM does, there are no real world consequences. The reason that people are using the games is to ascertain whether, if these LLMs are actually used in real life, they're more predisposed to certain actions such as escalation. And what the existing papers on this show are a couple different things. One is that there's extreme variation across the different LLMs out there, different, Llama, ChatGPT, Claude, and so on. They all act in different ways. And so there's almost no predictability in their responses to particular foreign policy or diplomatic questions. And then another thing that was observed is that throughout the course of war games, they tend to escalate often, unexpectedly, and often to the nuclear level, with little or no warning. And that was one of the most alarming findings that came out of a very prominent paper earlier this year, and has been mentioned quite frequently in the media. And so the idea is, well, if in a war game setting these models are doing this, we have to be extremely careful and not integrate them into real world national security making, lest they tell our operators to do things that are consequential, dangerous, or catastrophic.
And a lot of the things that you tried, and I do want to get into more the experiments and processes that you went into, but even on that previous paper, maybe would be helpful. Like, why was it getting to that point? Like, why was there this common thread of like escalation to that level in kind of the existing studies?
Well, we don't necessarily know the answer to that, and there are a bunch of theories. One is that LLMs are only as good as their training data. And we have a huge amount of data about wars that have broken out, but when non-events occur, a war does not break out, decides de-escalated, or something happened behind the scenes, we don't necessarily have data on that, or it's not published, or it wasn't deemed worthy of an article or a book about why that such and such war did not break out. And so there may be in the underlying training data for some of these models a paucity of examples of de-escalation and an overrepresentation of examples of escalation, and accordingly the models can only do what they've been trained to do.
And so then, as part of your study in paper, you tested and pushed back, if I'm not describing this in the right way, but really kind of tested different temperature settings or special instructions for the model that actually I felt like were relatively simple, and I'm not trying to downplay the work of some of the the changing of those dials, but that actually had pretty big impacts in terms of what the outcome, the escalation outcome was. Talk us through that, and kind of like what were the changes that you tried to make, what were the things that you started to kind of drill down on and investigate.
Well, you're absolutely correct. The interventions are very simple, and that was one of the main goals of the paper was to show that. So when we heard about these other studies that suggested that LLMs are inherently escalatory, we opened up the hood and we looked at the prompting and we looked at how those experiments were run by those authors, and we said, well, there are quite simple ways of stepping in here and asking the LLM to do a little bit less or to be a little more careful. And we suspect that, that was our hypothesis, that were we to introduce those, and particularly introduce interventions that are available to the average user, because we don't want an intervention that a computer scientist has to write. We want something that a staffer on the National Security Council could do on his own. And so that's why we replicated the pre-existing war games, but with our own experimental interventions. And we used several of them. One was temper moderation. So temperature is a model parameter that controls the variability in the model's output, its creativity, by flattening or increasing the probability distribution of the word associations that the model outputs. A higher temperature creates a more florid, creative, experimental model output, and a lower temperature, and these range from 0 to 1, a lower temperature makes the model choose the most probable words that are likely to fall one after the other. So we modified temperature to get at the creativity question, and then we just did simple prompt engineering, and prompt engineering is the very deliberate and careful description by the user as to what he wants from the LLM. So if you want the LLM to de-escalate or to take caution with particular actions, you tell it to do so. And we had different kinds of prompts that we engineered.
And I'm glad you bring up the different prompts, because I believe there was also one of the prompts, or maybe a couple of the prompts that you had used, actually like cut out all nuclear actions in the simulation. And to your point, like it was almost simple changes. Were you surprised that like you were able to get to that point where it would run these simulations and like in none of those cases there was a nuclear action?
I was surprised about that effect. I mean, that was one of the most dramatic effects in the paper. I thought that over hundreds of simulation runs, you would still be liable to get some extreme examples. But we managed to cut out the most extreme behavior. So I was surprised, I would say, to an extent. By the same token, we know that part of the object of this was demonstrating that if you simply tell the model, hey, be careful with the extent to which you escalate, or please consider the costs of that escalation against the benefits of doing so, it stands to reason that the model would recognize that doing something like causing a global nuclear war is very unlikely to have any benefits that justify its costs.
So when our parents told us growing up to be careful, there actually probably was some impact. If we're wired similarly to how LLMs are, just that the added reminder of cautiousness actually does have a bit of an impact. I was going to ask, because the flip side of this too is, obviously we don't want escalation to that level, full stop. But you could say, okay, well, so you've added as many parameters, you've dialed back the temperature, whatever Jonathan's saying, like that's how we don't get to that outcome. Do we run the risk of adding too many changing of the dial of temperature and changes in the prompt where the AI actually becomes too cautious and it's missing opportunities where maybe we should have been more firm or more aggressive in those simulations?
Yes, I think so. It's as possible to over-index on caution as it is to over-index on risk. But understand, of course, that in the real-world use of these models, we're not going to simply have them playing a game over 14 days without any human intervention whatsoever, and just reacting to each other. This was merely for experimental and data gathering purposes. In the real world, you have human operators with their own domain-specific context, may well be beyond that of the model in most cases, able to assess, oh, the model has has failed to, this particular suggestion is a non-starter, or based on my own prior understanding, this suggestion ought to carry greater weight.
And I think what was so powerful about the again, like the simplicity of the changes, the experiments, the tests that you guys did, was these are things that obviously through this lens of wargaming, but applicable, not just in a military environment, but also, in a financial environment or a crisis management environment. Like the applicability of the things that you're talking about, carry across, different industries, different verticals, right?
I think so. I haven't given too much thought to that. I'd like to stick to the military and diplomatic context, but I do think the broader lesson here is about uptake and alignment. And the fact that there is, as we mentioned from the beginning, a great appetite in using these systems to optimize processes. Even if initial attempts provide suboptimal outcomes, we can learn from those, through both actual research and also trial and error, to better align those models with user objectives.
And so the report, the findings have been, out in the wild, so to speak, for a little bit now. Any commentary or perspectives on like response from individuals, like reading what you're saying, trying to implement it in what they're doing, wanting to talk with you and your co-author? Like, what has the response been like to some of the things that you brought up?
It's still early days, so the publication is in preprint, and it's also it's under peer review. So we're hoping to get it in a publication that's aimed at the target audience of practitioners, because we want these simple methods to get into their hands if they're already using the models. The preprint's only really been about for a week or 10 days. And there's certainly been initial interest from within my professional network, people asking questions about it, of course, getting invited here to speak. And I've been able to share the findings via CFR with some of our researchers and invitees to council events.
Great. And then, I think to wrap, and feel free to take this in the format you want, I always think it's good to almost pretend like if people have been signing up to listen to us and they fell asleep for the entire time and they're just waking up and they're like, okay, give me the Cliff Notes version of this. Like, what is that one or two takeaways that you want people to pull out from this paper and remember, and carry with them?
Well, the first is that some people are saying AI is so dangerous that it could start wars on its own. And I think that's fantastical, because human beings will never delegate the decision to an LLM whether or not to start a war. The second is that uptake has already begun for very valid reasons, and alarmism is not going to assist us in reducing risk, but further research on alignment will.
Fantastic. Jonathan Panter, co-author of Managing Escalation in Off-the-Shelf Large Language Models. Seeing this in a publication near you soon, hopefully, but information is available. And Jonathan, really appreciate you making the time and having this conversation. I think just really compelling stuff. And, I think truly at kind of the bleeding edge of what we're going to see in the future of diplomacy in wargaming, and all of the above as AI becomes both a really powerful tool, but a tool that we need to figure out how to harness in a way that is contextual. It has the right guardrails. It helps us come to good decisions, especially in those critical technologies. If you're interested in learning more, or you're interested in joining the fund, you can see the QR codes on the screen behind me. The QR code on the left side of the screen gives you a self-service portal and access to our data room. The QR code on the right side of our screen is to schedule a call with one of our senior partners if you're interested in learning more about the fund's dynamics. And if you're already an investor, we appreciate having you in the community. Feel free to reach out to me, Hillary, or Stephanie, or anyone else that you've been in contact with at Alumni Ventures, and we will get you pointed in the right direction.